Pine Ridge County Jail looked like a gray concrete monument to human error. Behind barbed wire and bars, in cell number 47, Frank Miller counted down the days until his release. 18 months for assault and battery wasn't the longest sentence, but it was long enough for a man to change his mind about a lot of things, or conversely, to become more determined. Frank belonged to the second category. Every morning he woke up at 5:30, did push-ups, and remembered the day that changed everything. The day when his 20-year-old son Daniel brought home his friend, Michael, and announced that they were living together, not as roommates, but as a couple, but as a, "Dad, I'm gay." Those words still rang in Frank's head like a fire alarm. He remembered how the world stopped for a moment, how his wife Sarah turned pale and grabbed the edge of the table, how he felt as if someone had pulled the rug out from under his feet. And then came the rage. Frank Miller had worked with his hands his entire life. 30 years in an auto repair shop had taught him how to fix what was broken, to restore things to their original function. Engines had to run, brakes had to break, and sons had to carry on the family line and honor family traditions. When something didn't work right, it had to be fixed. That night, he raised his hand to his son for the first time. Daniel didn't fight back. He just stood there, covering his broken lip, and looked at his father with an expression that wasn't anger or resentment, but something closer to pity. It was worse than any punch he could have thrown. "You're not my son," Frank hissed, unaware that those words would prove prophetic. A week later, Daniel moved out. A month later, Frank got drunk and broke into the apartment his son shared with Michael. The result was broken ribs for Michael, a trial, and a prison sentence for Frank. Now, lying on a narrow cot, he wasn't thinking about remorse. He was thinking about how his time in prison had given him the opportunity to find the right path to saving his son. That path was suggested by Reverend Thomas White. The pastor began visiting Frank 3 months after his imprisonment. A tall, gray-haired man with piercing eyes, he spoke softly but convincingly. White had led the New Hope Church in Pine Ridge for 20 years and had seen many families destroyed by modern temptations. "Homosexuality is a disease of the spirit, Frank," he explained during one of his visits. "But any disease can be cured with enough faith and the right approach. Your son is not lost. He has simply strayed from the path." White talked about correctional camps, about therapy, about how other parents had managed to bring their children back to normal life. He talked about God's plan and a father's duty. Every word fell on the fertile ground of Frank's despair and anger. "When you get out, we'll help Daniel," the pastor promised. "But first you have to show him that you're still his father, that you love him enough to save him." Outside her house on Maple Street, 5 miles from the prison, Sarah Miller ironed shirts and tried not to think about her husband. It wasn't working. 18 months of loneliness had taught her a lot. She had learned to sleep without flinching at every sound. She had learned to make decisions without asking permission. She had learned to talk to her son without fear that someone would hear and explode. Daniel came every Sunday. He helped around the house, brought groceries, talked about his work at the library. They cautiously rebuilt their relationship, like surgeons working on damaged nerves, slowly, carefully, afraid of causing new pain. "How's Michael doing?" she asked last Sunday, still surprised that she could say his name out loud. "He's fine. He got a promotion at the bank." Daniel paused, then added, "Mom, have you ever thought about getting a divorce?" Sarah put down her coffee cup. Of course she had, every day since Frank had raised his hand to his son, but you couldn't erase 30 years of marriage with the stroke of a pen, even if those years had ended in prison and a broken family. "I don't know," she replied honestly. "Not yet." In the center of Pine Ridge, in a small public library building, Daniel Miller was sorting returned books. The work here was quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos that had reigned in his life for the past 2 years. In small towns, people remember scandals for a long time. Daniel felt the stares, heard the whispers behind his back, saw some acquaintances cross the street to avoid him. But there were also those who greeted him as before. Mrs. Johnson from the book club always asked about his mother. Dr. Harris nodded when he saw him at the supermarket. The library director, Miss Patrick, even offered him a promotion. "Times are changing, Daniel," she said. Slowly, but they are changing. Maybe. But Daniel knew that not everyone was ready for change, especially his father. Every night, as he fell asleep in the apartment he and Michael rented on a quiet street, he thought about the day Frank would be released. There were 4 months left until his release. Daniel didn't know what to expect. Attempts at reconciliation or another outburst of anger. Michael thought they should leave town. Start over somewhere new, where no one knows us, he suggested. But Daniel couldn't abandon his mother. Not now, when she had finally started talking to him again. At New Hope Church, Reverend White was preparing for the evening service. His sermon today would be on the theme of forgiveness, not the forgiveness that means accepting sin, but the forgiveness that opens the way to redemption. In his 20 years of ministry, he had seen many families destroyed by modern freedoms. Parents who had resigned themselves to their children's wrong choices. Children who had turned their backs on the faith of their ancestors. But he had also seen miracles, the lost finding their way home thanks to a firm hand and a loving heart. Frank Miller was one of those parents who didn't give up. Yes, he made a mistake by using force too early. But his heart was in the right place, and with God's help and wise guidance, even the most difficult situations could be resolved. White opened the Bible to a familiar passage from Proverbs, "Do not withhold discipline from a child, for if you discipline him with the rod, he will not die." Sometimes love required tough measures. That evening, in cell number 47, Frank received a letter from his wife. Sarah rarely wrote, usually only about practical matters, bills, or problems with the house. But today's letter was different. "Daniel asked about you," she wrote. "He wants to know if you plan to talk to him when you get out. Frank, I'm tired of all this anger. I want us to be a family again, a real family." Frank slowly folded the letter. Family, yes, that was what he wanted, but a real family was built on the right foundations, on God's laws, not on modern perversions. He looked at the calendar hanging on the wall of his cell. There were 123 days left until his release. 123 days to finalize his plan. Life went on outside the prison walls. Sarah was finishing her shift at the supermarket and thinking about what to cook for dinner for one. Daniel was closing the library and hurrying home to Michael. Reverend White was preparing a new sermon on the importance of not abandoning lost children. None of them suspected that the clock was ticking, that the decision had been made, and that sometimes love, distorted by anger and fanaticism, can become the most destructive force on earth. The dawn of March 15th was foggy. Detective Jessica Cole was finishing her third cup of coffee of the morning when the phone rang. 6 a.m. was too early for routine calls, too late for good news. "Cole here." "Jess, we have a problem." Sheriff Martin's voice sounded tense. "A county jail breakout, one inmate believed to be armed and dangerous." Cole set her cup down. In 12 years on the force, she had seen enough to know that prison breaks rarely ended well, especially in small towns where there was almost nowhere to hide. Who escaped? Frank Miller, 48 years old, convicted of assault. He was due to be released in 4 months. Cole knew that name. Miller's case had been the talk of the town a year ago. A father who beat his son for being gay. At the time, it had seemed like a typical family drama that had gone too far. Now the situation was getting serious. How did he escape? He was working on the prison farm. During the morning rounds, he went to the toilet and didn't come back. The guard didn't notice he was missing until half an hour later. By then, Miller had already disappeared. Cole was already pulling on her jacket. "Has the family been notified?" "I'm on my way there now. Meet me at the Miller's house in 20 minutes. Maple Street looked peaceful at that time of the morning. Small houses with neat front yards, parked cars, trash cans lined up along the curb. A typical American street in a typical American town, where the worst thing that happens in a year is a bicycle theft or a teenage fight, now that Idle was under threat. The Miller house was unremarkable among its neighbors. A one-story structure with white walls and blue shutters, a small porch, and an old pickup truck in the driveway. Cole parked next to the sheriff's car and saw a frightened woman's face in the window. Sarah Miller opened the door before they could ring the bell. She was dressed in a housecoat, her hair disheveled, her eyes red from crying. "He's gone, isn't he?" she asked, not even waiting for an introduction. Frank's gone. Sheriff Martin nodded. Mrs. Miller, we'd like to ask you a few questions. May we come in? The living room looked as if the woman who lived there had tried to erase all traces of a man's presence. There were no photos of Frank, none of his belongings, only family photos, where he had been carefully cropped out or turned so that he couldn't be seen. When was the last time you spoke to your husband? Cole asked, taking out her notebook. 2 weeks ago. He sent a letter. Sarah nervously fiddled with the edge of her robe. Just a regular letter. He said he missed home and wanted to make things right. And before that? I visited him in November, but it was a nightmare. He yelled and accused me of turning our son against him. I haven't been back since. Martin leaned forward. Sarah, we have to ask. Do you have any reason to believe that Frank might try to contact you? Or Daniel? At the mention of her son's name, Sarah's face paled even more. I don't know, maybe. He was very angry with Daniel. He said it was all because of him. Where is your son now? At home. I mean, at his apartment with Michael. She still had trouble saying her son's partner's name. I called him as soon as I saw your cars. Cole wrote down the address. Are there any other places Frank might be hiding? Friends? Relatives? He has a brother in Texas, but they haven't spoken in 10 years. He lost all his friends after they were arrested. Sarah paused. Except for Reverend White. He visited Frank in prison often. Cole and Martin exchanged glances. Prison chaplains sometimes became unwitting accomplices in escapes, providing transportation or shelter with the best of intentions. We'll talk to the pastor, Martin said. Right now, Sarah, we'd like to set up security at your house, just in case. You think he'll come here? Cole gently touched the woman's shoulder. We don't know what he's thinking, but it's better to be safe than sorry. At that moment, 6 blocks away, Daniel Miller stood at the window of his apartment and looked out at the empty street. His mother's call had woken him up at 6:30. At first, he couldn't believe it. His father wasn't due out for another 4 months. Why would he run now? But then it dawned on him. 4 months was the time Frank was supposed to spend thinking about his actions, perhaps even repenting. Running away meant there was no repentance, that the anger hadn't cooled, but had instead entered a new phase. Maybe we should get out of town for a few days, Michael suggested, putting his arm around his shoulders. There's that motel 2 hours away where we stayed last year. Daniel shook his head. I can't leave, Mom. Not now. Dan, your father is dangerous. He already hit you once and crippled Michael. What if he goes even further this time? The question hung in the air. Daniel knew Michael was right. He knew he had to think about safety, but part of him, the part that remembered his father before all this had happened, couldn't believe Frank was capable of real evil. Let's wait until tonight, he said finally. Let's see what the police say. New Hope Church was located in the center of town, in an old red brick building with a white spire. Reverend White met the detectives in his office, a small room filled with religious literature and family photos of parishioners. Of course I visited Frank, he said when Cole explained the purpose of their visit. It's part of my ministry, spiritual support for those who have lost their way. How often did you see him? Once every 2 weeks, sometimes more. Frank was going through a difficult period. He lost his job, his family fell apart, and he felt guilty about his actions. Martin leaned forward. What did you talk about during these meetings? White hesitated for a moment. About forgiveness, about how to find a way to reconcile with his family. Frank really wanted to repair his relationship with his son. Repair in what sense? Well, help the boy overcome his problems. Frank was convinced that Daniel's homosexuality was the result of bad influences, of not having a strong father figure. He wanted to give his son a second chance. Cole felt a wave of anxiety rising inside her. Reverend White, what exactly do you mean by help in overcoming homosexuality? There are programs, therapy, camps where young people can find the right path with the support of faith and family. White spoke calmly, as if discussing a cold remedy. Of course, it requires commitment from both parents and children. Did Frank mention any specific plans for his son? We discussed possibilities after his release. Frank wanted to organize a family intervention to show Daniel that he was still loved and wanted to help him. Martin made a note in his notebook. Reverend, when was the last time you saw Frank? The day before yesterday. We talked about his plans for the coming months. Did he say anything about early release? About escaping? White sat up straight in his chair. Of course not. Frank understood the importance of serving his time. It's part of his redemption. Cole studied the pastor's face. Something about his manner of speaking was alarming. Too smooth, too rehearsed. But they had no direct evidence. If Frank contacts you, will you notify us immediately? Of course, Detective. I pray that he turns himself in voluntarily and that no one gets hurt. By noon, news of the escape had spread throughout Pine Ridge. In small towns, information travels fast, becoming embellished with details and speculation. By evening, Frank Miller had become an armed psychopath thirsting for revenge in the retellings of local residents. Cole knew that time was working against them. The longer Frank remained at large, the more likely it was that someone would get hurt. In prison, he was restrained by walls and a regime. On the outside, he had nothing but his own demons. She sat in her car across from the Miller's house, watching the neighborhood. Patrol Officer Johnson was on duty across the street. Everything was quiet for now, but Cole knew that could change at any second. At 7:30, her radio crackled to life. Detective Cole, we have a lead. A witness saw a man who looked like Miller near an abandoned farm on the outskirts of town. We're heading there. Cole started the car. Got it. I'm on my way. But even as she left Maple Street, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were heading in the wrong direction. That Frank Miller was closer than they thought, and that his plans were much more dangerous than they appeared at first glance. The abandoned farm was empty. There were no signs of Frank there, only a vagrant who had spent the night in an old barn and vaguely resembled the fugitive. By the time the search party returned to town, it was dark. In their apartment, Daniel and Michael were preparing for a sleepless night. They locked all the doors, closed the curtains, and placed a chair in front of the front door. Michael took out a baseball bat, the only weapon in the house. This is crazy, he muttered, checking the locks for the third time in an hour. We're living under siege. It's temporary, Daniel said, though he didn't believe his own words. They'll find him. They have to. But deep down, he knew his father hadn't just run away. He had come for him, and the meeting that had been postponed for 4 months was now inevitable. In the house on Maple Street, Sarah Miller sat in the kitchen with a cup of cold tea, staring at her phone. Part of her wanted to call Daniel to make sure he was okay. Another part was afraid to hear the same fear in his voice that was eating away at her. 30 years of marriage. During that time, she had learned to read Frank's moods, to anticipate his outbursts of anger, to find the words that could calm him down. But the man who had escaped from prison was not the Frank she had married. This was someone else, a dangerous stranger with her husband's face. Somewhere in the darkness, beyond the lit streets of Pine Ridge, Frank Miller waited for the right moment. Escaping had been easier than he thought. Months of work on the prison farm had given him the opportunity to study the area, find blind spots, and plan his route. Now he was hiding where no one would think to look for him, a place that Reverend White had suggested during one of his talks on the importance of preparing for serious decisions. The plan was simple. Wait until the police got tired of searching. Let them believe he had left town. Then return and do what he should have done long ago, save his son, at any cost. The third day of the search began with a false alarm. A resident of a neighboring county reported a suspicious man near a gas station, but it turned out to be a truck driver resting between trips. Detective Cole was beginning to realize that they were looking for a ghost. Frank Miller had vanished into thin air. Maybe he left the state after all, Sheriff Martin suggested during the morning briefing. He had enough time to get to Mexico. Cole shook her head. No, he's here. I can feel it. Men like him don't run. They finish what they started. She studied the case file again. Frank Miller, 48 years old, mechanic, father of 2. No serious offenses prior to his arrest, just a few speeding tickets. A model citizen until his world was turned upside down. What about the pastor? Cole asked. Something about him bothers me. White. He's cooperating. He even offered to help with the search. That's what bothers me. At that moment, Reverend Thomas White stood at the window of his office and watched the street. A police patrol passed by the church every half hour. He had already memorized the schedule. Detective Cole was a good investigator, but like many people in her profession, she didn't understand the bigger picture. The ringing of the telephone interrupted his thoughts. Reverend White speaking. "It's me." The voice was hoarse, tired, but recognizable. White quickly closed the study door. "Frank, where are you? The whole town is looking for you." "I'm in a safe place. Tom, I need your help." "Frank, you have to give yourself up. It's the only way." "No." The voice grew harder. "We talked about this, about how sometimes love requires drastic measures. You said it yourself." White clenched the phone. Yes, he had said that. In the context of spiritual guidance, long-term therapy, gradual change. But now his words took on a whole new meaning. "What are you asking for?" "To meet. Tonight. Do you have the keys to the old Sunday school building?" White knew the place, an abandoned building behind the church that was scheduled to be torn down next year. The perfect place for a secret meeting. "Frank, I can't." "You can, and you must, if you truly believe what you preach." The line went dead. White sat with the phone in his hand for a long time, realizing there was no turning back. He had become part of a plan that went far beyond spiritual guidance. In the apartment on Pine Street, Daniel Miller tried to read, but the words blurred before his eyes. 3 days of confinement had done their job. He was beginning to feel like a prisoner in his own life. "I'm going to the store," he told Michael. "We need groceries." "Are you crazy? Your father is nearby and the police asked us not to leave unless absolutely necessary." "Mike, I can't sit here any longer. I'm going to start climbing the walls." Michael went to the window and carefully lifted the edge of the curtain. Everything looked peaceful outside. A few pedestrians, parked cars, a police car at the end of the block. "All right," he said finally. "But I'm coming with you, and we'll be back in half an hour tops." Daniel nodded. He needed to feel alive, even if only for a little while. The Fresh Mart supermarket was almost empty at this time of day. Daniel and Michael quickly gathered the necessary groceries, avoiding long conversations with the cashier. As they left the store, Daniel felt someone watching him. A middle-aged man was standing by the mailbox across the street. Baseball cap, sunglasses, denim jacket. Nothing special, but something about his posture, the way he held his head, seemed familiar. "Mike," Daniel whispered, grabbing his partner's arm. "Look at that man, near the post office." Michael turned around, but the spot by the mailbox was empty. "There's no one there." There was. I definitely saw him. Daniel looked around. The man had vanished as if he had never been there. Maybe I imagined it. But on the way home, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Detective Cole was reviewing phone records when one number caught her attention. A call to New Hope Church this morning, lasting 3 minutes. The number couldn't be traced, but the time matched the window when all patrols were busy checking false information about a fugitive. Coincidence? Cole didn't believe in coincidences. She drove to the church and found Reverend White preparing for the evening service. The pastor looked nervous, constantly adjusting his collar and avoiding direct eye contact. "Reverend, we checked the phone records. Someone called the church this morning from an unidentified number. We get calls every day. Parishioners, people who need help." "Was this call different?" White hesitated too long. "No, just the usual. Someone asked about the service times." Cole made a note in her notebook. "If Frank Miller contacts you, will you let us know right away?" "Of course, Detective. I'll be in touch." But something in his tone made Cole linger at the church for half an hour longer than he had planned. That evening, Sarah Miller sat in her living room trying to watch television. The police officer outside her window had been replaced by a young officer who stood up every few minutes to check the perimeter of the house. At 9 o'clock, the phone rang. Sarah glanced at the caller ID, an unknown number. "Hello? Hi, Sarah?" Her husband's voice, after 3 days of not hearing from him, sounded like thunder on a clear day. Sarah almost dropped the phone. "Frank? My God, where are you?" "The police." "I know about the police. Listen to me. I need to talk to Daniel." "Frank, please, turn yourself in. We can work this out. Get help." "Help?" His voice grew cold. Sarah, I've spent the last 18 months thinking about what's happening to our family, about how we lost our son. It's time to fix it. We didn't lose Daniel. He's sick, Sarah, and I know how to cure him. There was static on the line, as if Frank were calling from a cell phone on the edge of a coverage area. Tell him tomorrow evening, the old Sunday school behind the church. If he doesn't show up, I'll come myself. To your house. Frank, don't... The line went dead. Sarah hung up, her hands shaking. A minute later, the police officer on duty burst into the house. Mrs. Miller, is everything all right? I thought I heard a scream. Sarah realized that she had been screaming. The old Sunday school building stood in the darkness behind the church, surrounded by tall trees and overgrown paths. Reverend White walked slowly toward him, feeling each step bring him closer to the point of no return. Frank was waiting inside. He looked thinner than he had in prison, his cheeks sunken, his eyes burning with fever. He had changed out of his prison uniform and into old clothes, jeans and a flannel shirt that made him look like an ordinary worker. Thanks for coming, Tom. Frank, we need to talk. What you're planning isn't what we discussed. Wasn't it? Frank moved closer. You talked about parental duty, about how love sometimes requires harsh measures, about how you can't leave children in sin. I was talking about therapy, about working on it gradually. I don't have time for gradual. Every day that Daniel lives with that guy, he sinks deeper into his illness. You said so yourself. White took a step back. There was something dangerous in Frank's voice, something that went far beyond parental concern. What do you want from me? Help me set up a meeting. Daniel trusts you. You baptized him. You married his sister. If you call him, he'll come. And then? Then I'll take him away. There's a place in Texas, a camp for kids like him. They know how to work with difficult cases. White felt himself go cold inside. Frank, that's kidnapping. Coercion. I can't. Yes, you can. Frank grabbed him by the shoulders. Tom, you told me that God tests those he loves, that parents must fight for the souls of their children. This is that fight. White looked into the face of the man he had tried to set on the right path. Now he realized he had created a monster, fed by his own sermons and distorted by prison isolation. I'm calling the police, he said quietly. No. Frank pulled a knife from his pocket, a homemade weapon carved from a piece of metal. You won't call, because you're part of this too, Tom. Your visits, your talk about salvation, it all led us here. Frank, please. Tomorrow night, if Daniel doesn't come himself, I'll go after him, and then more people will get hurt. White realized he had no choice. He had become a hostage to his own beliefs, a puppet in the hands of a man who had taken his teachings to their logical absurdity. At Daniel's apartment, the phone rang at 10:30. Michael answered first. Michael, this is Daniel's mother. Please put him on the phone. Daniel took the phone and immediately knew from his mother's voice that something serious had happened. He called Dan, your father. He wants to see you tomorrow evening. Where? Behind the church, in the old Sunday school building. Sarah was crying. He said if you don't come, he'll come here, to our house. Daniel closed his eyes. The meeting he had been putting off for 2 years was finally inevitable. Mom, did you call the police? Yes, they already know. Detective Cole said it could be a trap. Maybe. But if I don't go, he'll carry out his threat. And that means someone else will get hurt. Michael grabbed his arm, shaking his head. Dan, no. This is crazy. Mike, he's my father. No matter what he's done, I have to try to talk to him. Maybe there's a chance we can work this out without violence. But even as he said the words, Daniel didn't believe them. A man who had escaped from prison 4 months before his release was not in the mood for peaceful negotiations. In the old Sunday school building, Frank Miller spent his last night of preparation. He checked all the exits, planned his escape route, and prepared ropes and a gag. Tomorrow it would all be over, one way or another. He took a worn photograph out of his pocket, a family snapshot from 5 years ago. It was him, Sarah, Daniel, and his sister Kelly in the backyard of their house. A typical American family, like millions of others. Frank traced his finger over his son's face in the photograph. Back then, Daniel was a normal kid. playing football, dating girls, planning to go to college and get a good job. Somewhere between that photo and today, something had gone wrong. But tomorrow, he would fix it. He would set his son on the right path, even if it meant breaking his will. Love sometimes required harsh measures. Reverend White was right. Frank hid the photo and lay down on the floor, placing an old jacket under his head. Tomorrow would be a long day. Tomorrow, the rescue of his family would begin. The morning of the fourth day began with fog that enveloped Pine Ridge in a thick gray blanket. Detective Cole had been sitting in her car across from the church since 4 a.m, watching the building through binoculars. Something told her that the answer was here. At 6:30, she saw Reverend White leave his house and head for the church. He was walking nervously, constantly looking over his shoulder, the behavior of someone who was hiding something. Cole waited until the pastor disappeared into the building and called for backup. It was time to stop playing cat and mouse. At the house on Maple Street, Sarah had been awake all night. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, thinking about how things had come to this. 30 years ago, she had married a kind, hard-working man who promised to take care of his family. Where was that man now? When had he turned into someone who would threaten his own son? The police patrol had changed an hour ago. The new officer looked young and more nervous than the previous one. Sarah understood how he felt. They were all waiting for something inevitable. In the apartment on Pine Street, Daniel and Michael ate breakfast in silence. The decision had been made last night after a long argument. Daniel would meet with his father, but he would not do it alone. Michael insisted on going with him, despite his objections. "He hates me more than he hates you," Michael said. "To him, I'm the cause of all his problems. That's exactly why you shouldn't go. Dan, we've been together for 3 years. Everything that happens to you happens to me too. I won't let you meet him alone." Daniel knew it was useless to argue. Deep down, he was grateful. The thought of meeting his father alone scared him more than he was willing to admit. At New Hope Church, Reverend White tried to focus on preparing for the morning service, but his thoughts kept returning to the previous night. Frank's face, the cold glint of the knife, the threats to anyone who tried to interfere with his plan. How had he gotten to this point? How had his attempts to help a lost soul turned into complicity in kidnapping? The sound of sirens made him go to the window. Police cars surrounded the church. Detective Cole was walking toward the main entrance, accompanied by 2 officers. White realized the game was over. "Reverend White," Cole said as she entered the church, "we need to talk, and this time, only the truth." The pastor sank down onto a pew. "He's coming tonight, to the old Sunday school building." "Who? Frank Miller?" "Yes. He forced me to arrange a meeting with his son. He threatened to go to their house if I didn't." Cole quickly jotted down the information. "Where is he hiding?" "I don't know. He called from his cell phone, but I think he's somewhere nearby." "Reverend, you do realize that you're an accomplice. You could have prevented this if you had reported it right away." White nodded without looking up. "I thought I was helping, that I could steer him in the right direction, but he turned my words into something monstrous." Cole was already calling for backup on her radio. "Tonight? What time?" 8 o'clock. She glanced at her watch. It was 7:30 in the morning. 12 hours to prepare. That should be enough time to set up an ambush. But Frank Miller had other ideas. At 2:30 in the afternoon, when most of the residents of Pine Ridge were at work or at school, he left his hideout. Not an old Sunday school building. That would be too obvious. Frank had spent the last few days in the basement of an abandoned house on the outskirts of town, a place he had known since childhood. The plan had changed. Too many police, too much attention. It was time to act quickly and decisively. He stole a bike from a house on the next street, an old mountain bike that would allow him to reach his destination unnoticed. The police were watching the roads, but they didn't expect the fugitive to be traveling on 2 wheels. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Sarah heard a knock on the back door. It was quiet, almost hesitant. The police officer was on duty at the front door, so she decided it might be a neighbor or a delivery person. When she opened the door, she saw her husband. Frank looked like a ghost of himself. Thin, unshaven, with burning eyes. He was dressed in dark clothes and was holding something that looked like a knife. "Hi, Sarah." She tried to close the door, but he had already pushed his way inside. "Frank, please, Shut up! He closed the door behind him and turned the lock. Where's Daniel? He's not here. He's at his apartment. Call him. Tell him to come here, right now. I can't. Frank grabbed her by the shoulder. You can, and you will, because if he doesn't come, I'll go after him myself, and the cop at the house will be the first victim. Sarah looked into the eyes of the man she had lived with for 30 years and didn't recognize him. This man was capable of murder. She could see it in his eyes. With trembling hands, she dialed her son's number. Dan, it's Mom. I need you to come home. Mom, what's wrong? You sound strange. Frank pressed the knife against her throat. Just come. Hurry. Mom, come alone, Dan. It's important. She hung up and looked at her husband. Satisfied? Not yet. But I will be. Daniel stared at the phone with growing anxiety. Something was wrong with his mother's voice. It was too tense, too formal. What did she say? Michael asked. She asked me to come. Alone. It's a trap. I know. But what if something happened to her? What if he's already there? Michael grabbed his car keys. Then we're going together, and we call the police. If he's there and he sees the police, he might do something terrible. Dan, he's already going to do something terrible. They reached the house in 15 minutes. A police car was parked at the front entrance, and an officer was reading a newspaper. Everything looked normal. Too normal. Daniel parked across the street and dialed the officer's number. Officer Johnson? This is Daniel Miller. Have you seen my mother in the last hour? No, son. Everything's quiet. What's going on? She called and asked me to come over, but she sounded strange. Do you want me to check it out? Yes, please. They watched as the police officer got out of his car and walked toward the house. He rang the doorbell, waited, rang again. No one answered. Johnson walked around the house, checking the windows. At the back door, he stopped and took out his radio. I need backup. The door's been broken into. Daniel jumped out of the car without waiting for Michael. He ran toward the house when he heard a scream from inside. A mother's scream. The cop rushed into the house first, Daniel right behind him. In the living room, they saw Sarah sitting on a chair with her hands tied. Frank stood nearby with a knife. Dad, let her go. Frank slowly turned to his son. Daniel, finally, we can talk. Sir, drop the weapon, the police officer ordered, pulling out his gun. No. Frank held the knife to his wife's throat. First we talk, as a family. What do you want to talk about? Daniel asked, slowly approaching. About saving you. About getting you back on the right path. Dad, I'm on the right path. I'm happy. I have a job, a relationship. A sick relationship! Frank exploded. You're living in sin, Daniel, but it's not your fault. You were led astray, but I can fix that. How? There's a place in Texas, a camp for people like you. They know how to cure this disease. Daniel shook his head. It's not a disease, Dad. It's who I am. No! Frank took a step toward his son, still holding the knife. This isn't you. You're my son. My normal, healthy son. At that moment, Michael burst into the house. Dan, are you okay? Seeing him, Frank turned pale with rage. There he is. That's the one who poisoned my son. Sir, put the knife down, the police officer repeated. Frank looked at Michael, then at his son, then at his wife. His eyes were filled with the chaos of a man who realized that his world was falling apart. I can't let this happen, he whispered, and he lunged at Daniel with the knife. The policeman fired, but it was too late. The knife went into Daniel's chest up to the hilt. The young man fell, clutching the wound from which blood was gushing. Daniel! Sarah screamed. Michael rushed to his partner, pressing his hands against the wound. Call an ambulance, quick! Frank stood over his son, looking at what he had done. The knife fell from his hands. His face was frozen in an expression of horror. I wanted to save him! The police officer handcuffed him, but Frank no longer resisted. He stared at the pool of blood beneath his son and repeated, I wanted to save him. I wanted to save him. Daniel died on the way to the hospital. Detective Cole arrived at the scene 10 minutes after the tragedy. The house was cordoned off. Witnesses were giving statements, but it was too late. What she had feared from the beginning had happened. Frank Miller sat in the police car, staring into space. When Cole approached him, he didn't even look up. Mr. Miller, Do you understand what happened? I killed him. His voice was empty, mechanical. I killed my son. Why? Frank finally looked at her. In his eyes was the pain of a man who had lost everything. Because I loved him, and I thought I knew how to save him. Cole closed her notebook. She had enough for a conviction: first-degree murder, kidnapping, assault on a police officer. Frank Miller would spend the rest of his life in prison, but that wouldn't bring Daniel back. At the hospital, Michael sat in the hallway, holding his partner's blood-stained shirt. Sarah was nearby, crying silently. Two victims of the same tragedy: a mother who had lost her son and a man who had lost his future. He wanted to talk to his father, Michael whispered. He thought he could change his mind, that love was stronger than hate. Sarah took his hand. He was right, love is stronger. Frank just forgot what real love is. That evening, Reverend White stood in front of the empty church and thought about the words he would say at the funeral the next day. How could he explain to his congregation that their spiritual leader had become an accomplice to murder? How could he live with the knowledge that his sermons about healing had led to the death of an innocent man? He looked at the crucifix above the altar, and for the first time in 20 years of ministry, he questioned his faith. If God was love, then what had happened in the Miller home was the complete opposite of divine. In the Pine Ridge County Jail, Frank Miller lay on a cot in a cell for dangerous criminals. 18 months ago, he had been sent here for hitting his son. Now he was back for killing him. The Pine Ridge County Courthouse was packed. In the 30 years that the building had stood, it had never seen anything like this. A case of a father murdering his own son had attracted not only local residents, but also journalists from neighboring states. Detective Cole sat in the front row, ready to testify. Next to her was Michael Anderson, holding a photo of Daniel. In the 3 months since the tragedy, he had lost weight and aged years. Sarah Miller took a seat on the opposite side of the courtroom. She couldn't look at her husband, who sat at the defense table in an orange prison jumpsuit, his back straight and his gaze cold. During his months in custody, Frank had shown no signs of remorse. Judge Margaret Harris, a stern woman of retirement age, opened the hearing at 9 o'clock sharp. The state of Texas versus Frank Edward Miller. Charges of first-degree murder with aggravating circumstances, kidnapping, and assault on a police officer. District Attorney James Wilson rose from his seat. This was his most high-profile case in 10 years, and the evidence was irrefutable. Your Honor, members of the jury, this is a case of cold-blooded, premeditated murder. Frank Miller planned his son's murder for months. He did not act in the heat of the moment. He methodically prepared for a crime he believed was justified. Defense attorney Robert Clark, appointed by the court, understood the hopelessness of his situation. His client refused to admit guilt and insisted that he had done the right thing. Frank Miller is a man of deep religious convictions who was misled by extremist views, but that does not excuse his actions, he said, knowing that was all he could offer. The first witness was Sarah Miller. She walked slowly to the stand, avoiding her husband's gaze. In the 3 months since the trial began, she had filed for divorce and changed her last name. Mrs. Johnson, the prosecutor began, using her maiden name, tell the court about the defendant's behavior after your son told him about his sexual orientation. Sarah took a deep breath. Frank became obsessed. He said he'd rather see Daniel dead than gay. It wasn't just a figure of speech, he was seriously considering it. Did he talk about murder? Yes. After he was arrested, when I visited him, he said, "If I can't save him, I won't let him live in sin." I thought he was just angry, but now I realize he had already made up his mind. There was a murmur in the courtroom. Journalists feverishly took notes. Mrs. Johnson, what happened on the day of the murder? Frank held me hostage for 3 hours before Daniel arrived. All that time he was preparing, checking the knife, rehearsing what he was going to say. It wasn't an impulsive decision. What did he say? That if Daniel didn't agree to go to the camp, he'd be better off dead. That a dead son is better than a perverted son. Those were his exact words. Frank sat motionless, showing no emotion. When his gaze met his ex-wife's, there was no shame or remorse in his eyes. When the prosecutor asked about the moment of the murder, Sarah began to cry. Daniel tried to get through to him. He said he loved him. that they could work things out. And Frank looked at him and said, "Then I'll put you out of your misery." And he stabbed him. Did that sound like an act of mercy? No, it sounded like an execution. Michael struggled to testify. 3 months later, he was still having nightmares. "Frank Miller looked me in the eye when he killed Daniel," he said. There was no madness or rage in his eyes. There was the cold determination of a man doing what he believed was necessary. "Mr. Anderson, did the defendant say anything after the murder?" "Yes. He looked at Daniel as he was dying and said, 'Now you are free from sin.' Then he turned to me and added, 'And you will never be able to corrupt anyone else.'" The courtroom gasped. Even the defense attorney paled. Detective Cole described how carefully Frank had planned the crime. In his cell, we found notes, a plan for the kidnapping, a list of what he would say to his son, even a draft of a farewell letter. This was premeditated first-degree murder. "Detective, did the defendant express any remorse?" "Not once. During questioning, he said he did what any normal father would do. He only regrets not doing it sooner." Psychiatric expert Dr. Elizabeth Stone gave a damning conclusion. Frank Miller was fully aware of the nature and consequences of his actions. He shows no signs of mental illness that could have affected his ability to distinguish right from wrong. "Doctor, how do you explain his behavior?" "Extreme beliefs taken to their logical conclusion. Mr. Miller sincerely believes that killing his son was an act of love. This is not insanity. It is ideology." When the defense attempted to present mitigating circumstances by calling Reverend White, his testimony only worsened the defendant's position. "I tried to steer Frank toward therapy, toward gradual work with his family," the pastor said. "But he told me that a surgeon doesn't leave a cancerous tumor hoping it will go away on its own, that sometimes love requires radical measures." Did he use those exact words? Yes, and he added that if medicine couldn't cure his son, he would find another way to end his suffering. The last witness was Frank Miller himself. His lawyer begged him not to testify, but the defendant insisted. Frank stood up confidently. During his months in prison, he had not changed. The same direct gaze, the same conviction that he was right. "Mr. Miller," the prosecutor began, "did you kill your son?" "Yes." "Did you plan this murder?" "I planned to save him. Death was a last resort, but I was prepared for it." "Do you regret what you did?" Frank looked at the courtroom where Michael was sitting. "I regret not doing it sooner, before he was completely lost to sin." The courtroom erupted in outrage. The judge had to restore order. "Mr. Miller, do you understand that you killed an innocent man?" "Daniel was not innocent. He lived in sin, corrupted others, rejected God's laws. I freed him from that burden." "Do you consider yourself an instrument of God?" "I consider myself a father who did what he had to do." The prosecutor showed photos from the crime scene. "Mr. Miller, does this look like an act of love?" Frank calmly examined the images of the blood-stained living room. "Love isn't always beautiful. Sometimes it requires sacrifice." "Whose sacrifice, yours or your son's?" "I sacrificed my freedom for his soul. It's a fair price." By the end of Frank's testimony, even his lawyer knew the case was lost. The defendant had essentially confessed to premeditated murder and showed no remorse. The closing arguments were brief. The prosecutor demanded the death penalty, emphasizing the particular cruelty of the crime. The defense asked for life imprisonment, citing the absence of previous convictions. The jury retired to deliberate on Thursday morning. The verdict was announced 4 hours later, a record speed for a first-degree murder case. Guilty on all counts. Frank accepted the verdict without emotion, as if it concerned someone else. Judge Harris scheduled sentencing for a week later, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. "Mr. Miller," she said, "in 30 years on the bench, I have never seen a more cold-blooded killer. You did not kill your own son in a fit of rage, but as a result of cold calculation. You deserve neither leniency nor sympathy." Frank stood up. "Your Honor, I did what I thought was right. History will vindicate me. History will remember you as a father who killed his son for daring to love." After the sentence was handed down, Sarah approached Michael. "Did you see his eyes?" she asked. "He still thinks he did the right thing." "I know. That's the worst part." "Michael, I'm sorry I married a monster." "You didn't know what he would become. No one did." A month after the trial, Reverend White left town. In his farewell letter to his parishioners, he wrote, "I taught a man to hate in the name of love. That is the worst sin a spiritual leader can commit. Frank Miller is a monster, but I helped him become one." In a maximum security prison in Texas, Frank Miller became a model prisoner. He read the Bible, attended church services, and even organized a Bible study group. At first, the other prisoners tried to kill him. Child murderers are not popular in prison, but Frank defended himself with such composure that they eventually left him alone. He wrote letters to various religious organizations, telling his story as an example of parental love. Some extremist groups declared him a martyr. He received hundreds of letters of support. Detective Cole was promoted, but the Miller case haunted her. In an interview with a local newspaper, she said, "The most frightening thing about this crime is not the brutality, but the killer's conviction that he was right." Frank Miller did not break under pressure. He methodically carried out a plan he believed to be just. Michael left the state, but could not forget Daniel's last words. Before he died, the young man whispered, "Dad, why? Not 'I'm sorry' or 'I love you'? Just why?" Frank never answered that question. A year after the murder, journalist Stephen Wright wrote a book called Murder in the Name of Love, The Frank Miller Case. In it, he cited statistics. Every year in the US, there are about 20 murders motivated by homophobia, about 30% of which are committed by family members. Frank Miller is not an anomaly, Wright wrote. He is the logical consequence of an ideology that teaches that love must be conditional and acceptance must be earned. On the 3rd anniversary of her son's death, Sarah visited his grave for the first time. The headstone read, "Daniel Miller, he loved and was loved." Next to the grave, she met a woman she didn't know, who was holding flowers. "Did you know Daniel?" Sarah asked. "No, but I have a gay son. After what happened to your boy, I realized that I want to accept him, not lose him." The woman left, leaving Sarah alone with the thought that Daniel's death might have saved someone's life. In prison, Frank Miller continued to count the days. On the wall of his cell hung a photograph of Daniel, the same family photo he had been carrying with him on the day of the murder. Every morning when he woke up, he looked at it and repeated, "I'm sorry, son, but I couldn't do anything else." It wasn't a request for forgiveness. It was an explanation he gave himself so he could live with what he had done. The Miller family story became a warning that the most dangerous hatred is the kind that masquerades as love, and that sometimes monsters aren't born. They're created by beliefs taken to absurd extremes. Daniel Miller was not killed in a fit of rage, but as a result of his father's cold calculation that a dead son was better than a gay one. It was not a tragedy of madness. It was a tragedy of beliefs that proved stronger than parental love.